Hello and welcome to Grey Matter Talks Tech, a podcast for dev and IT enthusiasts looking for tips and insights from industry experts in the tech space. My name's Sam Barnes and I'm actually one of the Azure Solutions Specialists here at Grey Matter, so welcome. And in this season, we've got a focus on developer solutions. So today's episode is all about GitHub, and I'm very pleased to welcome our guest speaker, Richard Fennel from Black Marble. Richard.
Hello.
And before we delve into the wonderful world of GitHub, I was just wondering if you could just do a quick introduction of yourself and tell listeners about Black Marble and specifically, I guess, how you guys help in and around the GitHub space, please.
Certainly. Yes, so I'm the CTO at Black Marble and one of the founders. We've been going since, now far too long, back in the 90s. And the main area that I consult in is around developer tooling to help people get the best out of their software development process. So that means I've been going out to people working initially back with the old SourceSafe-like products back in the 90s, then through TFS, and increasingly I'm seeing migrations and work like that towards the modern GitHub tooling set.
Nice. Yeah. So thanks for that. So I suppose to kick us off with GitHub then, it's probably fair to say that, as you just said, it's moved away from just being a code repository and more towards an end-to-end platform solution for developers to use. So with that in mind, I'd just like to ask you, why would listeners consider GitHub over other offerings that are out there in the market?
I think an important area is the familiarity of the product. I often find I do quite a lot of engagement with universities and various computer science courses as sort of an industrial guest lecturer. And I've increasingly found that though you would hope that universities these days would be covering modern software engineering processes, often they don't. Developers quite often, or students quite often, don't really have that much exposure to any tooling that supports their development process. So no source control, automated builds, CI/CD stuff. But if they have been exposed to anything, it is most likely GitHub these days. So if you're recruiting new staff, I think that's an interesting area to look at, that people will have come across GitHub because it is so common in our industry. As GitHub say, it's where people store code. It is very much their marketing push. But to come back around to sort of the more, what are the features that are there? It's using Git, which has become the de facto standard for source control systems. But it's not just limited to that source control. We do have a issue tracking system in there that's as easy or as complex as you want to make it. in that, if you just want simple to-do lists, it'll do that. If you want to have hierarchical control with templates of your work, with some project management features, it does that. But one of the really big growth areas we've seen in the recent years has been the adoption of GitHub Actions as being a super common way for people to actually build and automate the whole of their development process. So that from just building the code and then deploying it out to wherever it needs to go, but also automating what historically have been sort of manual processes within software development processes, such as things like if you've got a new contributor to your open source project, it's really good that they signed a contributor agreement. You can automate that with GitHub Actions. So it's got a very big reach. GitHub gives you a reach into all parts of the process if you choose to use it. But if you just choose to use it as a straightforward Git repo, it does that well as well. So it can be all things to all teams.
Sure. And I guess from my experience then, from a licensing perspective, we see that it's actually quite nice that if you're using GitHub, you don't have to just have the enterprise grade subscription or license. You can actually start small and build as your organization kind of adopts the technologies more and more, right?
Yes, very much so. So anybody can go to github.com and sign up for a free account. You get a lot on a free account. You've got public and private repositories. You've got access to all of the issue tracking. You get a certain amount of minutes of builds free of charge every month. You can use all of the advanced features like Codespaces, which I'm sure we'll talk around in a while, and Copilot, their AI programming partner tooling. But then if you have a commercial need for working on stuff, or you just want to get some more features, you can change that personal edition into a pro edition,
Mm.
There's also the Pro Plus edition now and the various team SKUs. But then as soon as you start to move into sort of a commercial business operating with it, you're probably going to look to moving onto GitHub Enterprise Cloud, or maybe GitHub Enterprise Server, their on-prem version, but that's probably quite niche these days. We don't see that many of our customers who are looking at running all of their developer tooling on-prem these days. The cloud offering is normally the place to go.
Yeah, sure. And I guess from our perspective and just seeing the interactions that our partners use it for, is I think they find it quite helpful having those kind of, I suppose, increase or exponential increase when they go up to the enterprise subscription, not least also the ability of deploying things like single sign-on and SAML, right, for security purposes. It kind of makes good logical sense for a corporate or a mainstream business to use that, right, and to go through with it.
Yeah, I tend to find that the deal maker sort of choice as to why somebody would want to go with GitHub Enterprise, normally the first point I tend to lead on when discussing that is, do you need single sign-on into your solution? If you already have a corporate directory, whether it be Entra ID or Okta or any of those sorts of pieces of tooling, there is the very good chance that there's some sort of regulatory audit requirement that your staff should always log in via that to get to all of the corporate resources.
Yeah.
And if that's the case, the answer in the GitHub space is GitHub Enterprise, because it can talk to these type of directories.
Yeah, for sure. And I guess it also sets a pattern for how you're going to adopt going forward, right? Because obviously we're talking solely around the developer space, but actually when you start to move then into the production space, you also want to kind of lead with your front forward foot and make sure that you maintain those really good, strong security best practices that both Microsoft and GitHub promote internally, really, right?
Yeah, certainly. That, with the GitHub Actions, you've got all sorts of dependent on the where you're trying to deploy to, whether it be on-prem private solutions or various different clouds, there is good tooling that can integrate into all of this sort of security landscape. And we shouldn't forget that the other biggie that comes with GitHub Enterprise is you have the option for GitHub Advanced Security, which is effectively an add-on to the GitHub Enterprise license, which brings a whole pile of tooling around the edge to check for secrets, to check for good coding practices, and also brings in tooling to help you manage updates of dependent libraries and the like. So there's a lot of things that will certainly make the auditor, compliance officer very happy by moving towards GitHub Enterprise, which you don't necessarily get with the professional SKUs. Some of the features are there, some of them can be bought as add-ins, but you don't get that overarching positioning of the product to bring that sort of, to enforce all of that policy.
Sure. And do you know, it's a really good point you make there as well, because I often speak to customers that kind of look at Defender for Cloud, which has got a DevOps module, which is good as a security posture manager to look at all of your environments, whether that be GitHub, GitLab, DevOps, Azure DevOps. But it doesn't necessarily have the granularity that you would find within the advanced security features of GitHub Advanced Security, right? So it's just kind of being able to actually get in amongst the weeds and actually understand, maybe if there's dependencies in there that you need to consider, and understanding if there's secrets that are maybe captured within your code as well. So it's a really good point to make.
Yeah, well, it's not as if other products out there don't exist that can touch these various parts of the space, security space, but it's the same. It's in many ways the same sort of discussions we were having 5-10 years ago. Sort of, I could go and get a best of breed source control solution and a best of breed project management solution, a best of breed build automation, or I could go and use something like GitHub that does all of them, or Azure DevOps or GitLab or whatever. And the choice somebody has to make is, do I want the pain myself of the integration of all of these various tools? Or am I willing to take an integrated solution from a vendor because it gives me a cleaner way of integrating it all together? And we're very much at that sort of position at the moment around a lot of the security tooling, that GitHub Advanced Security sitting on top of GitHub Enterprise surfaces stuff in a very straightforward way. You wire it in a straightforward way. A lot of it's done for you. But if you do have a requirement of some other security-based tool, that can still be done. They can still be wired in. There's commonality of import-export, and you can ingest the output of other tools into GitHub Advanced Security. So it's sort of giving you a bit of the best of both worlds, in the sense that you've got an integrated solution that's much of it's set up for you to make you productive quickly, especially when you start to look at things like Copilot sitting there to help you in the process of writing all of the templates. But if you do have some specific need, it still plays nice with the rest of the security and tooling infrastructure. As I say, it doesn't sort of matter which cloud you're using. We can talk to all of them. It's the same sort of arguments in around the security space as well.
Yeah, for sure. So I suppose with that in mind then, would you say that there's sort of features within GitHub that are typically underrated that you think developers should use more of? I mean, I appreciate we've kind of almost gone off on a tangent with regards to kind of a security focus here, but, just thinking some of the core features that we've mentioned, GitHub Actions, even things like Codespace, I specifically see that as being an underrated resource. Certainly if you've got vast sort of Git repos that you don't want to necessarily run locally because of performance, doing it in the cloud makes logical sense in a Codespace environment, right? So I guess is there key features? Are those key features that you would consider being underutilized and underrated at the moment by developers?
Yeah. I think the Codespace is an excellent one to call out, because it's not so much the fact that you can spin up large repos and the like, as opposed to having to pull things locally. The one I find is the biggest productivity gain is that inside a Git repo, you can drop a dev container definition that says exactly how the code space should be set up. It can install any add-ins that are required for VS Code. So as soon as somebody clicks on creating the code space, it will provision everything listed in that file. Whatever's needed to get a developer up and running, and with a test environment, everything's done. It's automatically provisioned. And that can be such a big productivity gain. So how often do you see a new starter arrives and they've got to fiddle around with the machine for ages before they can be productive? Or the one we found, because Black Marble is a software consultancy, we do bespoke development for lots of different people.
Sure.
So that means you can almost guarantee how you need your machine set up for one customer isn't how you need it done for another one. And even in enterprises, we find the same. I do a lot of work with companies who have often grown by acquisition, and you often find that different divisions inside their organization have radically different development processes. And a quick way to swap from working with one code base to another can be very useful, and Codespaces can be really useful for that. You don't have to worry about, I've got to get my machine, I've got to do this, I've got to do that, I've got to run that script. You can just go, create me that code space, and a few minutes later at worst, it's up and running. So I think that is a very useful one for productivity.
Would you say then as well that having GitHub Codespace actually gives you an opportunity in your business to, I suppose, unite, for use of a better terminology, maybe central IT admins with the development teams? Because often we see that there is almost a disconnect at times if there's not a cloud center of excellence, and actually having that kind of, as you put it, that uniformity to setting up the code spaces for the right project, being able to make sure from a compliance perspective, security perspective, but also from a kind of I suppose a productivity perspective, that having that conversation, it's a really powerful one that, both a central team and a dev team can actually have together and start that process before they adopt cloud fully.
Yeah, that certainly can be part of a very good part of the story. But I often find when I go into companies that the IT teams historically haven't been that engaged with their source control systems and the whole of the DevOps tooling, as you might expect. Though they write scripts, they don't acknowledge themselves as developers and have never historically found a need for those various tools. But GitHub and Codespaces particularly can often be a useful route in for that, that we can give them tooling that gets them into the good habits of software development processes. I've got a script to keep it under source control, I revision control it. GitHub Actions can be an interesting place to run those scripts in an automated manner, in a sort of traditional IT playbook style way that often hasn't been investigated. And again, as we've already said, that Codespaces can give you a really fast way to get up the suitably configured environment as quickly as possible.
Sure. So I suppose just on that point then is as well, I appreciate, GitHub Codespaces and GitHub Actions we've discussed, but it does also feel a little bit like AI, and especially Gen AI. If you talk in anywhere to Microsoft or even GitHub, it's being kind of thrown in the mix with pretty much everything. And I've noticed that obviously GitHub especially are putting a lot of emphasis on their AI capabilities, specifically through GitHub Copilot. Would you say that that's still an underrated feature for developers, or do you see more developers now starting to look at that? Just because I know that there's this push, if you like, about we've gone beyond just the 2 times faster or more productive developer to almost the 10 times faster, more productive developer, and that's kind of a big part of that story, right?
It certainly is. And if you looked at the Microsoft Build conference, which was 2 or 3 weeks ago, a lot of the sessions there around the GitHub tooling and the GitHub features was certainly very AI or agentic, to use the current fashionable term, based. And in answer to your question, I think developers have certainly seen some advantages to Copilot, but they're still looking at it as a super clever IntelliSense, I think, in many cases.
Yeah.
A lot of the engagements I'm having at the moment where we're talking around Copilot, we're having conversations around how can I write better prompts? Do I move from trying to write code to trying to write prompts that get Copilot to write the code for me? So I'm not certain that the question should be, are they missed features? Are they not using them? It's sort of the conceptual position of where developers are in the journey around AI is behind where the forefront of the industry is, if that's a way of putting it. So if we look at some of the demos that were done at Build, it's looking at you write a detailed issue in GitHub and an agent goes off and writes a code and writes a PR, and you as the human then review the PR to say that's good, it's passed all the automated tests, it's ready to go. And that's a very different story to where most developers are sitting at the moment. So I can see over the next 5-10 years that our industry will change radically because of this change in the way AI tools work. At the moment, they're a tool in our toolbox. They become a bigger thing, I think, going forwards. And it's important for developers to understand what they can do, what the tools can do for them now, and the direction that they're moving in, so they can sort of position themselves well to get the most out of them. And a lot of that around, at the moment is sort of, how do I best talk, let's use the word talk, to the AI solution to get the best out of it? You can't just rock up and say, write me a new customer management system. It's probably not going to do a great job. There is technique in how you work with it to get the best out of it. And it's certainly, if we come back to the question about overlooked features, looking at Copilot as a tool to help you as an individual learn, as opposed to a tool to help you do, is probably an area that's overlooked. I certainly recently have been using it in areas where I'm having to work with languages that I'm not that familiar with, just ones I don't tend to work with that often. And I'm finding that though Copilot is writing me solutions that do the job, it's also helping me learn those languages more quickly. It's in some ways going through the same process. I need to write a loop in this language. I can't remember how you write a loop. I would historically have gone off and looked at the documentation, probably looked at Stack Overflow and copied something. But as always, it's all well and good looking at documentation and hands-on labs and things like that. But I've often found going through a pre-written hands-on lab, I don't find personally the best learning experience. I know some people love that as a learning experience, but I've never found it that good. I find it's better to tackle your own little project. And that's where Copilot can loop in, because you get the same depth as it's still referencing the same materials and potential labs, but it's giving you an answer that's in context to what you're trying to do. So hopefully that light bulb moment goes off. I can see why it's writing it that way and doing this and doing that. And yeah, it becomes interesting as to, well, how much going forward would I bother to learn that new language if it's just writing it for me? And as long as I can test it and it meets all my business conditions and passes all my tests, am I happy with it? It's an interesting philosophical question for the future. But certainly today, these tools can certainly make you more productive in the sense of writing a lot of boilerplate for you. And they can certainly be very useful for helping you get up to speed on new languages, new code bases, the like. So coming back to example of the sort of the company that's grown by acquisition, and you've just suddenly got dropped onto a code base that you've never seen before. Might be in a language, it might not. Using the sort of explain this to me features of Copilot can really help. Or if you're a new starter, you've come into an organization, you've been asked to write something. You go, well, I know we've got a corporate standard for that. How can I do that? Well, with the latest versions of sort of Copilot Enterprise, we can start to link in corporate wikis and other resources along those lines. So you're getting an answer not in the generic, this is how you'd write it. You're getting the answer, this is the way we write it at this organization. And do you want me to scaffold that out for you? So it's potentially, I think it's stretching a point to say that they're unknown features, but they're an area that I think many people haven't explored as fully as they might at the moment, sometimes due to they don't have access to all of the features. Or also sometimes there's a reticence in some organizations over looking at AI tooling.
Sure. Yeah, it's a fair point as well, because to what you say there is you can see it from a developer maybe even just automating like a README file, so that they can actually have that in their documentation, but also then the other developers in the team getting up to speed on a project is really, really powerful from a productivity sense. But I appreciate that. There is hesitance, I guess, is probably a good word. Is there a way of overcoming that you typically find? Is that just a conversation with sort of key stakeholders in the business and kind of everyone at large, or is there other factors that kind of go into that?
I think the conversation is the key one. It's I often find appetite for change in IT departments is often maybe not what you'd expect. You always sort of assume, or I've always assumed that, everybody's got a technical bent in here. They'll always want to try look, new shiny, and I should be having to hold them back from rushing down the route of new shiny. But often that's not the case. There's a lot of the sort of, we've been doing this for 5 years. It's worked great for us. We don't need to look to move on. And that can certainly be a problem. If all of your competitors are moving on and they've now got more automation, they can release code faster, cheaper. If AI tools allow you to add new features more quickly or reduce bugs more quickly, or advanced security means you're not having to pause every so often to do sweeps of update all of your dependent packages because it's being done automatically by dependable, that can be a game changer for the productivity of the department. I mean, that in general falls down to the bottom line at some point in your organization. So having conversations around the benefits as opposed to the tooling is often the best way. But it always does have to be caveated in the sort of talking about risk and perceived risk and real risk. Anybody who's sort of looking in this space, I'd certainly go and look at the Microsoft and GitHub sort of Trust Center websites that give a lot of details on how things like Azure store stuff and how what GitHub pushes up, what data's stored, all of those sorts of areas. And often realistic conversations around that space can certainly alleviate and unblock sort of this form of project.
For sure, yeah. And it's interesting you mentioned that, because obviously the trust centers are a big part of it, but we have seen specifically a massive engagement, I guess is a good word, from Microsoft specifically in and around kind of a shift left mentality. So making sure that security is the forefront of everything. I think they even didn't release certain things for Microsoft Build purely because it hadn't actually met some of the criteria that they had. So they've actually created a program, or adopted a program, should I say, called the Secure Futures Initiative, essentially making sure that your identities are locked down, making sure that security is prioritized above everything else. And if it doesn't meet those high standards, then it can't be pushed out. So I guess that's kind of what you're saying here is that it's having that conversation internally to understand all the risks, but also all the benefits, and actually make sure that you adopt that shift left mentality throughout the whole process, which is super key. So we've kind of talked some of the features around GitHub Copilot, but how have you sort of specifically seen, or do you have any kind of stories around GitHub Copilot and how it's changed the way developers, or even yourself, how you code? I mean, I know you gave us that example about learning new languages, but I appreciate there's kind of reviewing code that's actually a lot more sort of key now to a lot of developers, and certainly with the adoptions of agent mode within GitHub Copilot is a big boon, right, for any developer?
Well, yes, certainly. I think the one I've been exploring is probably the best way of putting it of late has been when you're doing a pull request inside GitHub, you now have the option to request a code review by Copilot. So it's sort of moving from that assistant helping you write something to being able to look at the code you have written. And the fact we can jump between different large language models to try and find the one that's most appropriate to our needs is also an interesting area. So that's probably the big area of change I've certainly found of late, that I'm not just using it inside my IDE to suggest the next line or the next paragraph of code. I'm moving away from the IDE as I am writing lines of C# or Java. I'm moving more towards, hey, I've highlighted this block of code. Can you make it loop across this data set? Or can you refactor this out into a function? Or I'm tending to move to that sort of position in it. So it's changing the way I am writing code, I think, is the key. And as I say, I think this whole thing about reviews coming in PRs, I've not found historically. I've tended to go, make some suggestions, Copilot, to this block of code here to make it better.
Yeah.
I think the fact that it's being presented inside the PR is having that effect on me. And it's something I've often talk around to people, is that you've got to wear two hats as a developer, in the same way as you are as if you're writing a document, if you're writing a blog post or a novel for them. There's a phase where you're thinking about what you're doing and writing the feature. And then there's some point you've got to step back and review it to say, is it any good? Make the changes. And the PR process enforces that on us. Even if you're working on a solo project, I often, and I think many other people do, will still create branches and have a PR and try and switch that hat mentally to sort of go, is this good enough to go in yet, sort of thing.
Yeah.
Now, in a lot of organizations, that external review will be done by another person in your team. But what we often find in a lot of sort of corporates is that, especially if there's a lot of people working on a project, waiting for somebody else to do the review can be critical. The critical factor in how long things take. The addition of AI code reviews can really speed up that process. And if you're working on a small team, you would almost like, it's the AI becomes that second pair of eyes. But I think I can't stress enough that just because you've got an AI tool writing code or reviewing code doesn't mean that your code shouldn't meet the same criteria that any other piece of code would in your project. It still must build. It still must pass whatever integration test you've got. It still must pass whichever unit test you've got. It still must pass whichever manual test you've got. It still needs to meet the business requirements. The fact that an AI is involved isn't some magic bullet that's always going to churn out systems and they're going to be perfect to start with. They're going to be just as flawed with misunderstandings and not quite understood requirements as if humans were involved. But it's another tool in the arsenal to help us move forwards and get things out in the hands of our customers, whether they be internal or external, in a more cost-effective and quicker manner, which fundamentally most of us are going to be working for businesses, and that's probably the critical factor that decides whether projects are a success or not. Did it get shipped in a reasonable time, and does it meet the requirements? And if any tool in there can help speed up that process, it's useful.
For sure. It sounds very kind of reminiscent on some of the features that I've been looking at recently, which is in and around kind of the extensions that you can put in things like GitHub Copilot chat, and, you know, where it can kind of link into Azure so you can deploy, but also where you can almost run the you know, the testing through, you know, your model context protocol servers and things like that. So there's an awful lot of what I would call heavy lifting done by the AI agents that kind of saves you time. But I suppose it's looping in that human in the middle approach rather than just going because you know, those magic robots have just decided to do something that it's perfect. And I guess it's just having that what's the word I'm looking for? Almost like humility to accept that, you know, this is a good thing, but also I need to be actively involved and kind of stepping up to the plate and still doing those kind of checks.
Yeah, I think it's a takeaway for if you watch any of the things from Build, and all the videos are up there. You can go and have a look at the majority of the sessions. That it is you have these agents, you have multiple agents, as you mentioned, with different AI strengths and weaknesses. And you as the human are sitting there coordinating in the middle. You know, sort of you are passing off work to agents, saying, instead of you sitting and doing it with your AI sitting there next to you going, oh, this would be the good way to write the next line. The view now is more towards passing off a piece of work and saying, when you've done that bit, come back to me so I can review it. And you pass things off in multiple places, in multiple small little steps to try and move things forwards as a whole. So as I say, it comes down to it. It feels like it's changing our industry. We've had a lot of false dawns over my career and since we formed Black Marble. You know, the number of times we've been told, oh, well, we know developers in 5 years because of some rapid development tooling, or name some tooling that allows business users with 3 clicks to create every business application. They never quite deliver.
Yeah.
You know, they've always got to space these products for certain jobs, but you keep coming back to, in the end, some solutions just have to be written at a deeper level. And there's a lot of talk at the moment. Again, we're sort of saying, oh, there'll be no developers. And then someone else turns up and goes, oh, there'll be developers. But what it means to be a developer, I think, will change with this pass. In the same way, we're not sitting writing machine code anymore. We moved on to assembler and on to high-level languages.
Yeah.
Maybe it's a change of that sort of ilk that we're coming along at the moment. But it's an interesting time to be in the industry.
For sure, yeah, 100% echo that. I think you're absolutely right. In the next 5 years, it'll be particularly interesting. So I suppose the final thing I wanted to kind of just touch on, or one of the final things to touch on, is that we've obviously got GitHub as a repository, but it has now grown beyond that and become so much more. But we often have partners that are looking also at Azure DevOps and understanding, you know, is the use of GitHub and Azure DevOps recommended? Is one or the other better? Is there kind of hints and tips that you could maybe give the listeners of how to make it a success, you know, adopting one or the other, or both, even, just to understand what that journey looks like?
Yeah, that's certainly a really common style engagement for my team at Black Marble, that we've got customers who've been in the Microsoft space. For those who don't know, Azure DevOps came out in 2005 as TFS server, Team Foundation server, and it has had many updates over the years. Product rename around 2019, and moved from an on-prem solution to the cloud. And I still see an awful lot of customers who are in Azure DevOps, perfectly happy with Azure DevOps, and aren't looking to move away. Both Azure DevOps and GitHub are great products. They can be used completely independently of each other, but you can choose to use them together. How you do that very much depends on the goals of your enterprise development teams as to which is the best way to do it. There's certainly, I wouldn't say that one product is better than the other. The marketing position that was being pushed by Microsoft is that the GitHub is the North Star. It's the direction of travel where all the most advanced, most future-looking features are. But that certainly doesn't mean Azure DevOps is going away. It's still got development teams. They're still adding new features. And the big area that I tend to see the most change in there is its ability to talk across to GitHub and the like. So quite a common scenario I see is that a customer's already got Azure DevOps. They're interested in GitHub Advanced Security and Codespaces and all of those sorts of features like we've been talking around. Now, they're only available on GitHub Enterprise. So their migration path is they spin up a new GitHub Enterprise. They deal with all of the single sign-on questions. So they're still single sign-on into Enter ID. That means the same sign-on gets them into Azure DevOps. It gets them into GitHub Enterprise. And then they use a variety of means, whether it's done manually or done at scale using tooling provided by GitHub, the GitHub Enterprise Importer, to move Git repos over from Azure DevOps into GitHub, but they can still leave all their work item tracking in Azure DevOps. They can leave their automated build with Azure DevOps pipelines, but just reference the source that's inside GitHub. So they've got what's often termed as sort of the best of both worlds. Now, if they want to start moving to GitHub Actions for automated build, that's fine. They just start doing that. If they want to track some projects using GitHub issues, that's fine. They've got both options. But because the code's in GitHub, it enables all the GitHub Advanced Security. It enables all of the ability to use Codespaces. And that is certainly not an uncommon way that I see engagements. The other way of doing it is that people go, well, I'm really interested in GitHub Advanced Security, but I'm not willing to commit to going down the GitHub route for whatever reasons. Often a common one is data sovereignty. We have a requirement that our Azure DevOps, our source code must remain in, say, the UK. Well, that's fine because you can have Azure DevOps hosted in the UK Azure data centers. That's not an option at the moment for GitHub Enterprise. The only way you can have a GitHub Enterprise instance that's located in the UK is to use GitHub Enterprise Server, and a lot of people don't want to go down that route of having to manage that. So an option that they have is they can use GitHub Advanced Security for Azure DevOps and wire in the GitHub Advanced Security directly into their Azure DevOps instance. So we've got all sorts of ways that the tools can work together to try and come up one that best matches a company's journey. Because there's no one fit for every organization. It's impossible to come in and go, this is the definitive way that you build and write software. And while we're at it, let's specify you can only use this language. These questions just don't happen. The questions happen, but we don't have any good answers for them. So having that flexibility that we can wire them together in a variety of different ways makes perfect sense.
Sure, and I guess what you're saying is essentially is it depends on the familiarity with the business, right? Is that if they've got something that's working for them, there's no immediate sort of need to kind of just shift off. It's kind of just understanding and adopting the features that work best for you, and if there is a certain change that's needed, is kind of processing how that's going to work. But to your point, is that it's not like Azure DevOps is disappearing anytime soon. So it's actually quite comforting in that sense.
No, and it's still, as I say, that there's still active development on it. They're still adding new features. A common area that I certainly find with Azure DevOps is that a lot of companies have committed strongly to Azure DevOps work item tracking, and it has a lot of formality in the way you can use it, which some people see as an impediment, but a lot of organizations really like the fact that there's certain flows that everything has to go through. And there's a lot of customization, standardized fields and all of this standardization that can't be avoided, the type of thing auditors, compliance teams love. And that can be really important in many industrial sectors. GitHub has some issues, have more flexibility, and the formality you can have has greatly improved over the years, but they're different. And that can often be sort of, well, we don't want to rush to move over because we have all of our compliance. And the better together style way of working can be a really good way of bringing the best of both worlds into a team. And as I'm sure, as you know, it's that the licensing options that are available to enterprise customers now make that journey between Azure DevOps and GitHub all running them together far more cost effective than they used to be.
Sure. So my final question to you then, Richard, is so if there's organization business out there that maybe hasn't necessarily used GitHub a lot or has only scratched the surface on it, how would you encourage them to start? Because obviously it's not necessarily the case that they're going to just dive in with both feet and get an enterprise subscription. So is there kind of areas of focus that they can do as a team? Is there kind of skill areas they need to be aware of? Is there something that they need to do to enable themselves in as much as possible?
Well, I think the first area to have a look at is to encourage your teams to get GitHub IDs. There's a very good chance they already have. Have a look at all of the free features that are out there. Look at the GitHub fundamental training materials. There are some certifications if companies like to go down those routes, but certainly getting aware of the features that are available in GitHub out the box. You can start to look at all of the various features we've been discussing. Many of them are available on the free SKUs, but as a more formal sort of corporate view of it, it's start to look at how you think you might start to bring GitHub into your software development infrastructure. How might it link with what you've already got? Should you be looking at sort of migration strategies across, or is a better together approach the type of thing you want? There's all sorts of options in that space, but you can't beat getting your hands dirty, getting in there, having an experiment with it and see if the things work for you. If you're starting a new sort of proof of concept little project inside your company, well, maybe think, well, instead of spinning this up as Azure DevOps, maybe we should spin this up in GitHub and just see what works well for us, what doesn't. Maybe experiment with the better together sort of models. The one barrier I do tend to see in organizations is that if, as I said, single sign-on is critical to you, you do need to start to look at the GitHub Enterprise to make sure that is in place before you start. But if you do have a means to try without that sort of stuff in place, there's no impediment to you going and starting today on the various features that are available on GitHub.
Sure, and I think I speak correctly when I say that there are trial licenses that are available for some of these which organizations can adopt, but also I guess maybe something that's not necessarily more widely known is that actually working with a CSP cloud solution provider like Grey Matter, for example, you can enable metered billing on your enterprise account. So essentially those licenses, those consumed resources are done via your Azure subscription and therefore leverage both a discount and also engagement should you need it. So yeah, certainly there's lots of areas that they can certainly adopt GitHub with best practice in mind and best price in mind as well.
Yeah, and I think that key point that was relatively recently, isn't it? It's in the last few months metered billing has become available, and that certainly reduces the barrier to adoption for an awful lot of organizations, in that you can just put a small sort of tiger team on trying the POC inside your enterprise, and there isn't some multi-year commit to them having to use stuff. So that can be a very effective way for teams to try before you buy at scale, you might say.
Yeah, 100%. I think also for kind of that metered billing approach is quite nice for a lot of FinOps teams as well. They like having that single invoice with the ability to dig into what's been purchased and assign that to why, so that it just makes that conversation a lot easier. Because the one thing that we don't want to do as businesses is stunt any kind of development or innovation, right? But it's having that foresight to kind of go, yeah, this is necessary, this is what we need, but actually align that cost to an actual outcome and goal. So yeah, I 100% encourage that move for metered billing that GitHub did. So that's good.
Yeah.
And I think that brings us to the end of our episode and brings it to a good close. I'd like to thank you, Richard, for joining us again. GitHub is certainly a huge topic, and I think we've covered quite a bit. I don't know if I could choose a favorite area because I think, from an AI perspective, that's certainly the juicier topic, but I think it's quite powerful for developers to know out there that there's some really good interactions between both GitHub and DevOps and actually understanding where that sits. I think there's some really good bits depending on where you are in your journey, really. So that's really good. So to those listening, you may not know that Grey Matter is actually focused on helping developers and software as a service companies solve challenges and succeed with tech. So a software and cloud solution provider, it was essentially a no-brainer for us to actually partner with Black Marble. They develop solutions across the Microsoft platform, from custom development software solutions, which we heard Richard talk about, all the way through to Azure DevOps consultancy and projects. They're experts in their field, so you know you're in safe hands when it comes to actually managing and deploying with your development journey. While me and the team at Grey Matter can also continue to help provide your expertise in and around everything else. So whether this be licensing advice all the way through to being kind of your cloud infrastructure experts. So thanks very much for tuning in. And if you have any questions for me or the Black Marble team, please do email in. It's info@greymatter.com. In the meantime, if you haven't already yet, then make sure that you do subscribe to the podcast to hear more from industry experts on a wide range of topics in the tech space. Thanks very much. Bye for now.